And I'm gonna go live in 3, 2.
So, welcome everyone, and good evening to you all. My name is Rhonda Rosen, and I am the Programming and Exhibitions Librarian here at the Hannon Library. On behalf of the entire outreach team, welcome to virtual Faculty Pub Night. So we're very excited. Tonight's Faculty Pub Night will feature Dr. Jason Jarvis, who's an Assistant Professor of Communication Studies. Dr. Jarvis is going to discuss his recent project, Greenwashing, the Visual Politics of Oil in Southern California. And you can see I am wearing my green shirt in honor of tonight's presentation. So before we begin, I would like to remind you all that Faculty Pub Night is the library's opportunity to spotlight our faculty's accomplishments to our students, staff, faculty, and during COVID to anyone who has Zoom. So please spread the word. And now, of course, we get our ground rules for tonight. So we will be recording this evening's presentation, and it will be available on the library's YouTube channel. After Professor Jarvis's presentation, I will have a short one-on-one conversation with him, and then we will open it up to questions from the audience. And if you have a question for our speaker, during the presentation, you are welcome to submit it by using the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen. All questions will be compiled by our outreach team and submitted to our speaker as time permits. So for now, before we hear from Dr. Jarvis, I'm going to invite Dr. Craig Rich, the Associate Professor and Chair of the Communication Studies, to introduce tonight's guest speaker. Craig?
Great. Good evening, everyone. It is both my pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Jason Jarvis. Earning his PhD from Georgia State University, Dr. Jarvis joined Loyola Marymount University in 2015. Since then, to put it simply, he has thrived. Dr. Jarvis is an assistant professor of rhetoric and media in the Communication Studies Department. His teaching and research interests center on the visual politics of images in environmental media and digital culture. In particular, he's keenly concerned with the rhetorical power of visual and social media and its ability to influence our perceptions of the world and alter human behavior. He is published in top-notch journals, including the Contemporary Argumentation and Debate, the Journal of Vincentian Social Action, and the Global Media Journal, as well as authored a number of book chapters and encyclopedia entries on topics ranging from digital dissent and image politics, the digital public sphere in South Korea, and environmental politics in mass media. This evening, Dr. Jarvis will be discussing his forthcoming book with Lexington Books, entitled Greenwashing Los Angeles, the Visual Politics of Oil in Southern California. This research is also the focus of a new course, Immersed in Urban Oil, which will be co-taught by Dr. Jarvis and Tara Pixley in the journalism department in the spring of 2021. So, as I say, without further ado, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Jason Jarvis.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. Before I go into my presentation, I want to say thank you to the library staff and to Dr. Rich for being here this evening to introduce me. I really appreciate this opportunity, and I hope that we have an opportunity to get sort of deep into the muck of oil in Los Angeles. I'm going to share my screen now, and we will go forward. So my research project in particular is looking at the way in which the Southern California oil industry has progressed and historically. And so I'm going to talk about two things in particular this evening. First, I'm going to start with a discussion of petroculture and what that means in particular for people here in Los Angeles and residents in Southern California writ large. And then second, I'm going to look at the role of social media and how social media has brought us to this point. So the first half of what I'm going to do is really background and what brought me to this project. And then I'm going to look particularly at the first chapter, the first case study in the book project that I'm working on, which is Postcards of Southern California, and the way in which social media has historically allowed the development of oil in Southern California to happen somewhat invisibly. So we're going to start with a pop quiz. And here I would ask you all to take 60 seconds. I'm going to give you a moment to think and look around your home, your room, your office, wherever you may be at the moment, and to make a quick list of items that you see that are made from oil. And in particular, if you look at the graphic that I put on the screen here, it would show you that petroleum products come from a range, there are a range of places that we get out of a barrel of oil. So a normal barrel of oil is not just divided up into gasoline, it includes a lot of other stuff. And in particular, I want you to think about this section here, the other products. So give you 30 or 40 seconds. And then when you get a chance and you've made a quick list, type in the chat. I want to see how many things you all may have that are made of oil around you. Here I will stop talking for 30 seconds. I'm getting 10. Anybody got more? 5. All of them. If you said all of them, in some ways that's sort of true. Part of the reason I'm doing this project is simply that I've kind of been shocked by what we are living in. When I saw this graphic, I was completely blown away. I thought that I like to think that I'm a smart guy. I like to think that I know a little bit about the world. And about a year and a half ago, I saw this picture and I just could not explain it. Somehow or another, I didn't realize that we all exist inside a petroculture. So if you said 10 products, you massively underestimated it. And what I've come to realize is that if we all decided to quit driving tomorrow, we all switch to electric cars, we're still going to be wrapped up in oil. And that is part of why I think that Tara and I are going to be teaching that class in the spring, which is that the sort of sheer weight of the way in which petroleum influences our lives is something that I just had not realized. And once I did realize it, then that really started to make me ask more questions. And part of that simply is, what's going on? How is this possible that many of us, if you did realize that, I'll simply say I didn't, but how do we get to this point and not be aware of what's going on? And so it's not just petroculture writ large. No matter where you live, that previous graphic applies to you. But in Los Angeles, there's something strange and unique going on here. So I'm going to answer a few questions over the next few minutes before we take a quick break and open it up to comments or questions. First, I'm going to describe when oil was found in Los Angeles. I'm going to answer the question of how many oil fields exist here, how many refineries there are, and second, and finally, I'm also going to answer the question, where did Beverly Hills come from? And you might be surprised, as I was, a child who grew up in the Deep South, despite my lack of a drawl, to find out that the Beverly Hillbillies lived in an oil field. I'm still trying to wrap my brain around that particular fact. I didn't know Jed was in fact living on top of oil. The history of oil in Los Angeles, I think, is largely hidden, and that is by design. The history of oil is that many people attribute Edward Doheny, a noted Catholic philanthropist, as being the person that found oil in Los Angeles in 1897. And he did technically find oil in LA proper. But when we think of Los Angeles, many people are actually talking about the county, not really the city. And LA County, we start looking bigger. The first major field that was in the region was actually the Brea Olinda field in 1880. And interestingly, that field is still active because it's on the fault line and because every time there's an earthquake, it reveals new pockets of oil, so they continue to drill it. Beverly Hills was founded in the oil was found there in 1908. Montebello, you'll notice a lot of beaches because a lot of the oil is along the coastline. Torrance, Inglewood, Venice Beach, Playa del Rey, that's relevant to us at LMU. And this is not a complete comprehensive list. This is a list of the major finds that happened before up to the 1932. But there's more than that. There are in fact 28 oil fields in the Los Angeles basin. Not just a couple, but 28. There are 7 refineries, and these fields have names that most of us would know. Torrance, pretty close to campus. El Segundo, there's a refinery there as well as an oil field. And the field that's closest to campus is the Playa del Rey field. Most of us didn't realize that Playa del Rey isn't just an expensive place to live. It is in fact a place that is steeped in oil. It is the field that is closest to campus, and it is undoubtedly the case that there were LMU graduates from the up to the 1960s who could stand on the bluff and look longingly out over the ocean and watch oil being pumped every day, because there were lots of derricks there in that field. Today, that particular field is actually a gas storage facility. So when you drive through Bayona wetlands, do be aware that in fact you're driving through a gas storage facility. It's not just a wetlands. And you can see that if you look off to the left, if you're coming from campus and you're headed out towards the coast. It's easy to actually see that particular storage facility because it's there and it's off on the left. But the Del Rey field is quite large and extended all the way up into Venice. And it's the one closest to campus. But the fields run all along the coast, and the refineries tend to operate in a ring, mostly through here. So if you're in the South Bay and you live anywhere in the South Bay, you don't live that far from a refinery. And quite frankly, you live all around oil, or oil is all around you, whether you're aware of it or not. The other fact about the oil fields, which I've learned and which I find somewhat troubling or very troubling, is that oil fields follow the fault lines in Los Angeles. And so if you're thinking, well, why would you want to drill on a fault line? The answer is because there's oil there. And the oil fields here follow the fault lines to the point where there is credible academic research and scholarly research that suggests that this is one of the reasons that Southern California is so seismically active. It's not just because we have naturally occurring faults, which we do, but that oil drilling has provoked instability in those fault lines and is responsible for at least 4 of the 5 largest earthquakes in Los Angeles history. In particular, the earthquake that occurred in Long Beach in the 1930s, which is pictured here, was definitively caused by oil drilling. I also have been investigating that particular fact a little bit because there's some rumors or there's dispute about whether fracking causes earthquakes. And what I actually found, the most recent book I read was by an oil executive who worked for ESSO and whose job was to be a seismologist. And he argues quite persuasively that fracking doesn't cause earthquakes, but he does argue that the earthquakes in Oklahoma are caused by saltwater injection wells. And that's unfortunate for us because saltwater injection wells were mandated in Long Beach in the 1960s because the land fell so much, because so much oil was taken out of it. So some places in Long Beach dropped up to 30 feet in response to the amount of oil that is taken out. And so the city mandated that they use saltwater injection wells to try and manage that instability as they took oil out. So we should care about this. This stuff matters to us. It is important because we live here. And this history is largely hidden. So we think about Beverly Hills, to put a finer point on it. Beverly Hills came out of a failed oil field that was bought by Charlie Canfield in 1906. He wanted to find oil. He bought a bunch of land. There were a lot of people making money on that at that point. And he failed. Not because the oil wasn't there, but because actually he didn't drill deep enough. So they didn't go far enough into the land. Their drilling was unsuccessful. So the land was turned into a residential section. They called it Beverly Hills, started selling plots. A few years later, oil was actually discovered. And the picture you see here is from 1928. Fox Studios is in the center. And the studio itself housed a number of oil wells. As many as 52 wells would eventually be drilled and hidden on the grounds of Fox Studios inside the studio itself, covered up with plants and shrubs and things to make it seem like it wasn't there so that they could continue drilling. And this went on for quite some time. And even today, if you go to the mall in Beverly Hills, you'll be standing near an active oil well. It's hidden by a building that you can't actually see it, but it is there. What's fascinating and kind of troubling about Beverly Hills is the fact that drilling eventually stopped, but it was restarted in the 1950s. Beverly Hills High School was actually built on abandoned wells. And in the 1970s, royalties from that drilling that was taking place there reached $1.5 million. And at one point, 19 wells were operated on the high school. The account I read about this talked about how football players would come home with oil-stained shirts after football practice because the wells were right next to the track and the athletic fields. And there were a number of kids who got sick. The sad news is that there was a cancer cluster at that high school. So many English teachers died teaching out of one high school room that they eventually closed the room because teachers refused to teach there. Eventually, a company called Vinoco bought the well, or bought the wells, plural, because they had a method for squeezing extra oil out of them. And in doing so, they decided they wanted to paint the derrick to make it look more child-friendly. So they invited children from the local cancer ward at the hospital to paint the well, and they called it the Tower of Hope. This is all true, and I'm happy to pass on citations. Frighteningly, they eventually discovered a cancer cluster afterwards. It turns out that pipes are checked for leaks using radioactive iodine. And there was a large thyroid cancer cluster at that high school. And you can't really get thyroid cancer unless you're exposed to radiation. And they discovered this cancer cluster. And it also turns out that radioactive material is used to check for leaks. And there were lots of emissions. You may remember this if you've been in Los Angeles for a while. Erin Brockovich got involved with it. And the case, which did go to court, was eventually thrown out on summary judgment by the judge. So it never actually saw a jury. But this gives you an idea of the extent of what's going on. And what I will simply say is if very well-to-do high schools like Beverly Hills High School have to deal with oil wells, you can only imagine what's happening in poorer parts of Los Angeles around refineries. The situation in Wilmington, for example, is simply, I could simply say, is not pretty. But this is what we live in. These are wells. This is the well in Long Beach. Many of them are covered now to look like office buildings. They're camouflaged because in the 1950s laws were passed about that. That's the well off Belmont Shore in Long Beach Harbor, which you may have seen if you've been there. It's not actually an island. It's just a series of oil wells that was put together by what they call the THUMS. That's Texaco, Humble, Union, Mobil, and Shell. Those are all the companies that are on that island drilling for oil. And that's because the Wilmington oil field, which extends to the harbor, is the third largest in the country. The other picture that's here is the methane vents. When you build on top of abandoned oil wells, there's a gas problem, which is to say the gas comes up. A Ross department store, for example, blew up in 1985 because of too much methane accumulating in the basement. That was in near Hancock Park. And so these are methane vents. You can find them in Playa Vista if you walk around. They're near the playgrounds. And this is what you have to do in order to make sure that too much of that stuff doesn't build up. There are schools built on top of this stuff. So we're going to take a break here. If people have questions, I'm happy to answer them before I move into the second half of the presentation. The other thing I would like you to do is to take this particular link and to open it up and find your home, at least find LMU. The link is to a what's called a California Well Finder, which is to say that it is the map that the state of California uses to track all of the wells that are in Southern California. So I'm going to put that into the chat, give you all a couple minutes to look it up. When you go onto the map, you'll need to zoom in. It maps all the wells in California, so it wouldn't just be Southern California. But as you zoom in, what you're going to find is that the wells kind of get big. So every black dot represents a well that's either active or abandoned. Wells can be, there are a bunch of orphan wells is one of the bigger issues we have in California, which is that a lot of wells are inactive. But as you zoom in, you will see, for example, this is LMU, Loyola Marymount. The nearest well to us is at Wright Middle School. If anybody's got kids there, FYI. And if you look over towards Playa del Rey, what you'll see is the abandoned storage facility. There's some wells here on the edges up in the neighborhood around Playa del Rey, and most of this is gas storage facilities. So they've turned Playa del Rey and Bayona wetlands into a storage area. But when you get over to Playa del Rey and into Marina, you'll see that the drilling continues apace and that there are in fact lots of wells. Personally, when I saw this map, I didn't think it was real. I initially reacted to this map by saying there's no possible way this could be happening in the most populated county in America. But in fact, if you scroll down, this is all true and it's all real. And if you live, particularly in the South Bay, what you see is an astonishing amount of wells. So many, it's hard to really wrap your brain around how much is going on down there. All right, here, if there's questions, I'm happy to answer them. And if not,
Do you want me to give you a few comments from the Q&As now, or you don't want to wait?
I mean, I'm happy to do that now before I move into the postcards, or you know.
Okay, so Nicole Murph said Beverly Hills High School had 19 operating oil wells. Just to be sure, is this the same school that protested against Los Angeles Metro from extending the Purple Line train? Do you know?
I believe that's true, although I think that debate predates my my move to Los Angeles, so I won't claim to be a real expert on the Metro debate. But I mean, the well is one you can certainly see. There was one DERRIC, but it was 19 wells within that particular space.
Okay.
They drill horizontally, so they can drill from one space, left, right, whatever, so they can go out beyond the space itself.
Okay. Casey Mulkerin said, if you were in government, what policies would you implement to try and start moving away from the high levels of oil usage?
I think, honestly, the short-term problem facing the California taxpayer is the amount of money it's going to take to clean up the abandoned wells. $500 million, $500 million to clean up if we start today. And with oil companies going out of business because prices are low and because of the pandemic, this is not going to be a problem that's easy to clean up. So that's one of the issues we'll be looking at in the class is where are these things and who's responsible for them? And once the company goes belly up, nobody takes responsibility, so we become responsible. So I would like to see those cleanups happen immediately. One of the problems is that there's no incentive to cap wells completely because drilling technology improves and because no well is ever actually dry. So a well that's been completely taken, quote unquote, would still have 50% of the oil remaining. It would just lack the pressure to get that oil out. So completely decommissioning a well almost makes anti-financial sense for a company. If they can cap it, let it sit idly, and then come back to it, that's almost more economical than capping it. And to put a finer point on that, Rachel Carson Al Gore Middle School here in Los Angeles was directly across the street from an abandoned gas well, and they sued to have it closed. The company restarted the well rather than decommissioning it.
Wow.
So scary irony.
Yeah. Another question from Dean Brancolini is, I grew up in Long Beach, so I grew up all around oil wells. Oil money provided significant funding for our schools, which were excellent. There seems to be a lot of slant drilling in Long Beach now. My parents still own some oil rights under their property. Is that dangerous?
I mean, you know, people grow up here all the time around all this stuff. So I can't say that every person that grows up around oil wells is going to get sick. At the same time, I would not be comfortable growing vegetables in my backyard in Long Beach unless I had the soil tested. I'll be real with you, because one of the things I haven't talked about is that in addition to the refineries and the wells, There are thousands of miles of pipeline that run underneath Los Angeles County, and pipelines leak, all of them. So if you live near a refinery, even if you're, say, west of it and you're not breathing most of that air because the air is normally blowing west to east, that doesn't necessarily mean that things like emissions are the only problem. There's leaks, there's gas flares, anyway, yeah. I'm going to be hesitant to buy land in the South Bay. That's my honest answer.
Yeah. And so Alicia Berger asks, is the tar on the beach from the oil wells then?
Maybe. There are lots of natural seeps here. If you even go back to early explorers that were looking at California, I found the earliest descriptions I found of oil were like 250 years ago from people who were near Santa Barbara. Oil seeps off the coast of Santa Barbara are normal. So there are, and oil companies are quick to point this out, that it's not fair to say that all the oil you see has been come up from drilling, because it's not in California. That oil has been used as a natural resource by Native Americans before any settlers got here from colonial powers. It was something that was a local resource. So just because you find a tar ball doesn't necessarily mean anything. It could be from drilling, but it also could be from a seep.
Okay, and I'm just going to ask one more question, then we'll turn it back to you. So Rachel Van Houten asks, how is this related or not to the governor's recent proclamation regarding banning gasoline automobile production by 2035? Or is it just a symbolic gesture?
I wouldn't say that's a symbolic gesture. I think that's very significant. To me, the actual symbolic gesture was a little bit lesser known policy, which was just announced, which is that they're trying to create a plastic recycling market. I mean, other people may know more about this, but the reading I've done on this is that the reason there is no plastic recycling market is that plastic degrades every time you recycle it. So I don't really know what it means for the governor to create an artificial plastic recycling market. That sounds like a giveaway to oil companies to me. The other thing that sounds like a giveaway to oil companies is that Gavin Newsom has not been great on stopping fracking in California writ large. So the relationship between our government here in California and oil companies is remarkably cozy, despite the reputation we have as a green state.
Got it. Thank you. I'm going to turn it back over to you then.
All right. So now I'll move into the second part where I'm talking specifically about my research project with relationship to postcards. So the study I'm doing says, how did we get here? Having learned all this, I've learned about petrocultures. I saw that map while we were trying to buy a house, and my real estate agent thought I was the devil. She did not like me very much because I would not live near places, and we would always see how close we were to wells or refineries, which, quite frankly, given the cost of property in Los Angeles, made me a very hard customer. Subsequently, I started asking this question: how do we get to this place where the most densely populated county in the United States is also home to some of the most extensive urban oil fields on the planet? That just doesn't seem to make sense. And what I came across was actually a KPCC article that looked at the history of oil drilling here, and it had a postcard from the LMU library. And so I thought I should look into that. And the more I looked into it, the more I realized is that it wasn't just one postcard. There was a series of things happening, and that brought me into this sort of larger study of how social media is being used by oil companies, not just in the present, but in the past. And my research project in particular looks at those postcards for the first two chapters as old social media. And then it comes forward to the present to look at how social media is being used, say, in El Segundo. You may have seen the advertisements that talk about how Chevron is saving the blue butterfly because they're all doers, and they planted some flowers to protect the blue butterfly. Never mind the fact that they release benzene every day that is undoubtedly bad for the blue butterfly, not to mention the residents that live nearby. I'm also looking at postcards in relationship to the park system, because oil companies encouraged the park system. In fact, the California park system was entirely paid for by oil royalties. All those beach drilling locations were places that companies wanted to get into. And so in order to do that, they exchanged oil royalties, earmarking them for the California park system, which had no budget, and in exchange got the right to drill on beaches. And so you had beach drilling here in California up until the 1960s. So I'm also doing a case study that looks at sports and the way that DERRIC has been used as a mascot and is still used as a mascot at Montebello High School and at Huntington Beach High School as well. And more recently, the way Chevron is partnering with Los Angeles Football Club to make themselves seem green. The specific study that I want to talk about here is about postcards. And postcards, while we may not think of them in this way, are actually an early form of social media. Monica Cure, who's a professor here in Southern California, wrote a book that I read recently from 2018, and she argues that postcards were a wildly popular form of communication, and particularly among wealthy and socially mobile elites, so that people collected them in droves and then displayed their prized postcard collections in sitting rooms and parlors, something that they would show off to their friends when they were socializing. And what's really interesting to me is that she pointed out that mailed postcards were more valuable than postcards that were just collected. So wandering down to the beach and buying postcards for yourself, not so great. Having a postcard mailed from your friend who went to Paris or whatever, or a pen pal somewhere around the world was infinitely more valuable. So it was the socially used postcards which actually had more value than ones which were just collected on your own. One of the things that Monica talks about, Dr. Cure discusses, is that all of the social upheaval and all the chaos we currently have around social media, racial, gender, colonial questions, questions about privacy, all of the things that we have with modern social media, really those sorts of questions existed around postcards. We just think of them sort of as this quaint tourist thing. But before they became a quaint tourist thing, they were ways for people to communicate with strangers. They were ways for lovers to communicate. There were codes that were developed around the public-private dichotomy of a card being sent through a public mail, but being sent to someone specifically, perhaps with private messages or coded messages. And so questions of gender, questions of race and racism, because there was a whole history of postcards that justified and furthered racism in terms of lynching, and colonialism. The fact that colonial powers like the British Empire would create postcards so that their citizens could symbolically possess different locations were part and parcel of the larger questions raised by the social media revolution of postcards. And so my research adds to this conversation. I think it's very well developed, and there are a couple other scholars that I point to in my work, but I want to add the fact that I think postcards also facilitated the domination of nature. And oil postcards in particular, like the one that's shown here, I think really bear that out. Because what could be more natural than an orange well or orange grove with oil wells? And so I argue that what's happening is it's a process of greenwashing. You may or may not have heard this term before, but it's a public relations tactic. And I think once I describe it, you undoubtedly can think of examples that you've seen in your own life. So greenwashing is an attempt to promote the appearance of products and commodities as environmental or green, while disavowing or hiding the environmental impacts. And so greenwashing is a deceptive practice. And different scholars have pointed to, say, 7 different types or ways that this happened, but largely it involves trying to make your product appear to be really environmentally friendly when it's not. A great example of this being Fiji water, which tries to convince you that it's the most natural water on Earth, and yet at the same time, it's wrapped in a plastic product, it's shipped around the world, and locals aren't drinking it, so it ain't really all that environmentally friendly. Postcards were used to greenwash DERRICs, and here, I just want to give a shout out to the library and to the Werner von Boltenstern postcard collection, which is an amazing treasure trove of texts. Our library collection is really, really fascinating, and while I'm pulling the oil postcards out of it, I would encourage any of you who are doing historical work, particularly on Southern California, there is just an amazing amount of stuff there. The trick is that it is time consuming to go through. You know, you don't have individual cards that you can just pull up on a database. You've got to go through them. And as in the process of finding the cards that I used, I discovered all kinds of amazing stuff. So I would really just encourage people to use this, and the librarians have been just tremendously helpful in getting access to the archive itself. I think it's a tremendous resource. Petroleum postcards in particular, which I found, you know, at this point about 100 of, and which I think I'll end up with more once I get back into the archive, really tried to make oil infrastructure appear like it was part of a landscape, like it was something that's just normal and that it should be there, as though why would we think it's not normal to have orange groves with oil wells all over them. And so there was an effort to make the infrastructure appear non-threatening, to appear part of the landscape, and to appear normal. And so as we're looking at these, if you all have ideas, I would certainly appreciate any feedback. I've been staring at them for a while, but if you see things that maybe I should consider, please feel free to pass on that feedback or anything that comes to mind as we're looking at these. This particular card is fascinating because it documents gas flare tourism. The derricks, in this case, have all these small lights coming at the top of them because there's gas escaping from the well itself. And one of the problems in Southern California is the intense amount of gas that accompanies oil. So natural gas, the reason you have oil and gas companies is because these two things often occur together. And Southern California oil wells were particularly known for the number of blowouts, meaning there was a large amount, and there is a large amount of natural gas in the ground here. So much, in fact, that in the first couple of decades, there were millions of cubic feet that were flared off. The derricks and the fields became tourist sites for two reasons. One was just people were attracted to all that bright light at night. And they had a slightly romantic feel from the distance. The second reason they became tourist areas was that oil well operators, realizing that people were flocking, took that as an opportunity to make money. They set up tents, they sold food, they sold shares in individual wells. And while some people made a lot of money, there were also a whole lot of hucksters that just ripped people off. And a couple of those scandals became quite famous locally. And so oil people did not develop necessarily the best reputation. Doheny himself, who I mentioned earlier, was infamously part of the Teapot Dome scandal, which rocked a presidential administration. But gas flare tourism was a big thing for a whole lot of the wells. And you end up with a postcard like this, which talks about the famous oil fields at night, particularly for this reason. This is probably my favorite postcard that I've found in the collection so far, largely because of how utterly false it is. One of the things that's true about this is that there was a whole lot of wells in people's backyards. Los Angeles is famous for the urban oil drilling field, but the wells that you see in the background of this particular postcard, that part's true. You know, there definitely were wells everywhere. People were competing to get the oil out of ground fast enough. What's false about this is how beautiful it is. If you had a white house with an oil derrick behind it, there is no way your house would have been lily white like this. It would have been pockmarked from explosions. It would have been covered in oil spatters. And this beautiful suburban American dream of an oil well in every backyard is not one that anyone wanted to live near. Local social movements in opposition to drilling were fierce. They were particularly effective up to a point, but after World War II, they largely failed because of the need and imperative to drill for oil, and oil companies used that to their advantage to kill local opposition. So one of the questions sometimes people have is, well, why didn't folks stop it? Well, there was a lot of effort to try and stop it, but largely money won out over people. And this particular postcard really kind of gets at that. This is a much more accurate postcard, except for the beauty of it, which is that it looks quite idyllic. But you do get an idea of how much drilling took place on Signal Hill. Signal Hill in Long Beach was an epicenter of early drilling, and because people had already settled it, it really, really got hammered. In fact, it's described, historically it was described by many people called it Porcupine Hill because the derricks made it look like there was a porcupine on the top of it. Some of the descriptions I've read of Long Beach Harbor are places we wouldn't recognize today. One description I read suggested there was so much oil that had run into the harbor from the drilling that there was a 2 or 3 inch thick layer of oil, so that when boats were coming in, they're just cutting through oil and oil slicks. One description I read of Signal Hill described it as constantly being shrouded in mist, because one of the things that happens with oil is that in order to make it flow, there were steamers that would inject the oil with steam so it could flow more easily and they could transport it. And so you had lots and lots of steam that was created in the process of drilling, and subsequently Signal Hill would be shrouded in mist, not because there's a big fog rolling in, which is common along the coast, but because that fog never left because there was so much drilling happening there. This is an aerial view of Signal Hill, which gives you an idea. There are definitely people who made money, but I gotta say, if you lived amongst that, you were really earning your cash, because there's no way it was anything that looked quite this pleasant. It was loud, it was dirty, it was polluted, and it was dangerous. People regularly died on the job doing their job drilling for oil. It was not a safe thing to do. So living amongst the drilling would definitely have not been a pleasant experience. So that kind of brings me to the end of what I have to talk about, I guess, in general. The point I would make is that one of the things that's definitely shocked me since starting this project was the fact that I've learned that the palm trees are not natural in Southern California, but in fact, the oil derricks definitely are. And this is an aerial view of Signal Hill itself, not a postcard, but an overview shot that gives you an idea that postcards that showed the Porcupine Hill were in fact fairly accurate. The fields were full of derricks as far as the eye could see. That brings me to my thesis, California. Greenwashed, but not quite as green as we'd like to believe it is. And now I'm happy to, that's my presentation. I'm happy to open this up to questions and comments from folks.
Okay, so Brian Trainer says, if there's time for another question at some point, how many of the oil drilling operations in the LA area are also connected to the Archdiocese through investment, etc.?
I don't know. That is, you know, there's a bunch of areas that need to be researched. What I do know is that the Doheny family was Catholic, and that Edward Doheny was one of the largest oil men and one of the richest people, and certainly in California, if not the world, in his day. I do know that he directly helped set up a seminary somewhere, I want to say in near Santa Barbara. I don't really know whether there was any donations to Loyola Marymount. I can't tell you. I am aware that after his death, his wife was a very noted Catholic philanthropist. So that's just an area that's not, it's a question I'd like to look into, I guess, but it's not central to my book. So the article on LMU is one that I may look into in the future. Perhaps when we can have one of our students look into that in the spring when we do the Immersed in Oil class.
Oh, that's a great idea.
Yeah, so I'm curious too, but at the moment, not central to my work.
Great. Allison Noyes asks, it's interesting to me that these postcards would be considered greenwashing. I understand why, because the postcards place the wells in nature and don't show how the wells would destroy the natural beauty. But I wonder if you could talk about how our gaze has actually changed. Perhaps people found the industrial as beautiful in the past.
That's a really fascinating question for a couple of reasons. One is that there's a woman that actually Cynthia Beck introduced me to, one of our librarians. And the LMU just bought a painting actually by, I believe her name is Cowens. I don't want to mispronounce. I believe it's Joanne Cowens. I think so. That's correct. And she actually painted, she got an award from the oil industry because of her paintings. And she paints all the derricks and things as very, how do I say this? She idealizes them as very beautiful, as wonderful parts of the landscape, as a sign of progress, which I'm sure many people certainly had that perspective early on. And that allowed a lot of drilling to happen. So, I mean, that is a very interesting question, particularly because I've just become aware of that artist, and that was in the conversations with Cynthia. And so I think the other thing I would say about that is I'm not sure that the postcards were successful. So I think it's an effort to greenwash, but I'm not necessarily confident that they worked because there have been ongoing efforts and because the lived reality of being near the derricks was kind of terrible. So it may have been more persuasive to the tourists coming through than it was, say, the local Angelino living near it. So that raises sort of that question of audience. Who were they really directed at?
Right. So Dean Brancolini is following up on her family place. What happened to all of the oil derricks in Signal Hill?
Some of them are still there. I mean, they're still drilling in Signal Hill. So that, you know, to go use the well finder map. They took the derricks down. Now there's mobile derricks. They're much smaller. That structure itself is no longer necessary in some cases to do drilling. So the technology's improved, but they either took them down or they camouflaged them. So in the 1950s, there was a wave of camouflage because they started to feel they were unsightly. And so they started to come down or to just be hidden in fake apartment buildings or fake office buildings or what have you. So they're still there. That's why the well finder is fascinating. Find the nearest well and go see what does it look like.
Right.
It could easily just be an office building.
So a question from the outreach team. Did you encounter any counter narratives to an oil drill in every backyard?
There was tons of progressive movements. The Venice is a really fascinating story that I hope I get to tell at one point, but there was a lot of, Venice had laws against drilling. Oil was found in the Delray field. They changed the law to allow drilling, and then Venice got ruined. But this was in like the 1930s. So there's something, if you look up the disaster of Venice in 1930s LA, huge local scandal, because once they allowed drilling, what happened was it ruined the canals. The canals were filled with oil. And then nobody wanted to live there, of course, because it's not fun to live there anymore. So folks made money, but then most of the residents were very unhappy with the after effects, because all the promises of riches didn't match up to the polluted nature of their homes. So they ended up passing restrictions, and local opposition was quite fierce. And that's one of the stories that I keep seeing over and over again, was that people revolted. They didn't like it, but you know, there's money involved, and World War II entered the picture in the 1940s and really crushed a lot of the local opposition.
And it's always, money is always the bottom line.
And then there was a war, right? So it's, you know, at that point, it was like, well, federal government says drill, baby, drill, and so local government doesn't matter.
So aside from the postcards, what other resources have been important in your research?
Well, I'm looking a lot at modern social media. The El Segundo story is really one that I've just seen because I was watching TV and I was doing this project, and they played this commercial. It was all about how Chevron had saved the blue butterfly. And you can go see that, or you drive right past the butterfly preserve when you go south of the airport going up to the El Segundo refinery. And you see it, there's big signs, the blue butterfly preserve, all that stuff. And I'm not saying Chevron hasn't done anything to protect them, but I mean, the long-term consequences of having an oil refinery in your neighborhood for 100 years dwarf whatever happened that's good for the butterfly. I'm sorry. So, you know, cheers to the butterfly, but I mean, you know, kids with cancer, breathing benzene every day, I don't think that's great. And yeah. El Segundo as a location just is mind-boggling to me. Caught between a refinery, an airport, and a water treatment facility, and yet you have homes that cost $500,000 or more. I just don't, yeah.
Crazy.
As an outsider, I can't wrap my head around El Segundo.
Yeah. We're running out of time, but I do have just a couple quick, hopeful questions here. One person says there's an amazing tower on Pico Boulevard that looks like a Jewish temple, but it's an oil derrick. Is that the one at Doheny? And
yeah, that may have been the one I showed, the Pico. But they're all over town. So that's one of the things where I'm still trying to, this is one of the things we're gonna have the kids do in the spring, is try to take pictures of this stuff.
Yeah, I could take a picture of that one because it's near my house, I'm sorry to say. And then the final one is, let's see, Robin notes the similarity between the Watts Tower and some of these images. Was this on Simon Rodia's mind?
I don't know, I'm not sure.
Well, you should talk to Professor Paul Harris about the Watts Tower.
Okay, fair enough.
I understand where Robin is coming from on that one, so.
Okay, I mean, I'm not from Southern California. That's part of why this is all sort of, to me, it's just like, how could any of this be true? I just, as an outsider, we don't live near refineries. We put those in the woods somewhere. Yeah.
The first lesson as a new Californian is anything can happen in Los Angeles.
Well, and with the population pressure, they're willing to build stuff almost anywhere, right?
Yeah.
There's land, whether it's abandoned oil wells or not, it's land.
It's crazy though. Okay, so we're gonna wrap this up. This was great. I've learned so much, some of which I wish I didn't know, but thank you very much. And we certainly would like to thank you and Dr. Rich for coming to us and being with us again and sharing the time with us. We also always want to thank our Dean, Christine Brancolini, who always continually supports the Hannon Library's fabulous programming throughout the year, every year. I would like to also remind you all to come and join us next month, December 1st at 5 p.m., when we will feature Professor Jennifer Rothman, who is from the Loyola Law School and who will be talking about her book, The Right of Publicity, Privacy Reimagined for a Public World. That should be another very interesting thing. And then I am going to share my screen and bring up a QR code for some of our business classes. So let me do that. Here we go. And there's for those students. And then finally, I just would like to tell you all to please take time to fill out the very short survey that will pop up once you leave the program, as it will help us plan and improve our future programming. It's hard to imagine it could be any better because this was such a great and really interesting night. And thank you again, Dr. Jason Jarvis.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. Appreciate you having me.
So everybody have a good night, and I hope your week goes well. Bye-bye.